Hi everybody, welcome to a new episode on my channel. Today my guest is Dr. Simon Blackburn. I will just do a quick introduction to him. Dr. Simon Blackburn taught philosophy at the University of Cambridge. He is a distinguished research professor of philosophy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is also a fellow of Trinity College and a member of the Professoriate of New College of the Humanities. He was previously a fellow of Pembroke College and has also taught full-time at the University of North Carolina as an Edna J. Curry professor. He is a former president of the Aristotelian Society. He was elected a fellow of the British Academy in 2002, as well as a foreign honorary fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2008. Dr. Blackburn, it's really an honor to have you on. Thank you for coming.
It's very kind of you.
So I invited you to talk a little bit about metaethics. So
Yes.
Just for people who don't know about it, could you please tell us what exactly metaethics deals with?
Yes, the contrast is between what is sometimes called first-order ethics and metaethics. First-order ethics is the kind of question you get into when you ask, is something permitted? Is it obligatory? Is it impermissible? It's wrong. So, for example, there are debates about whether, say, early-term abortion is permissible, that women ought to be allowed to have the choice, or whether it's ought to be illegal, which some people think, and similar questions. So those are direct questions about what ought to happen or what ought to be the case, or what people ought to do. And similarly, there are issues which aren't so much about oughts, but are about what's good or bad or better or worse. Is it better to give money to my children or to give money to charity? Is it better to look after my immediate family or look after the world, look after the polar bears or give money to Greenpeace or something? So there are questions about what is better or good or better to do, and questions about what you ought to do or must do. And those are questions for first-order ethics. Second-order ethics asks about the status of our answers to those questions. Are they subjective? Are they matters of culture and history? Is there any hope for objectivity in ethics? Is there any hope for proof? Is there even a notion of truth about these matters? And those are questions about the status, if you like, of ethical discourse. And the typical opponents in this sort of area, some philosophers say, yes, we are realists, we think there's a real issue here, there's real truth, there's facts. Other philosophers say, no, it's a matter of opinion, it's just a matter of attitude or a matter of emotion even, and therefore there'll be never any resolution, there'll be never any proofs or any even good arguments on one side or the other. So that's the ground. Mm-hmm. The meta-ethics, I mean meta meaning here about, it actually means after in Greek, but still, because Aristotle's books on metaphysics came after the books on physics, that meta-ethics means about ethics, it's about its status.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so, if you don't mind, I would like to go perhaps through some of the main sources that people resort to when they're trying to create or justify an ethical system. So,
yes.
In my case, I'm particularly interested in what comes from evolutionary psychology or evolutionary theory, because there are a lot of scientists nowadays that try to say or to imply that evolutionary psychology by itself, by virtue of telling us how, because we evolved in a highly complex social environment, we developed moral sentiments and they say that these moral sentiments are at the basis of the ethical systems we construct, and then also during evolution we eventually developed the capacity for abstraction and rationalization, and that would be another thing to put into the equation. But I guess that what I would like to ask you about this is, would our evolved moral sentiments have been enough to create moral systems?
Well, I think so. I mean, something has created them, so presumably it's a combination of evolutionary factors and perhaps historical and cultural factors. I think I mean, I like the idea of evolutionary ethics, but I don't like forgetting the possibility of a contribution from social history, from culture, from perhaps the peculiar situations of different parts of humanity. So people sometimes think that, for example, the Inuit who live in the Arctic have a very different sort of sense of survival, and therefore different attitudes to life and death, than those of us who live in more sort of comfortable circumstances. But all that will be a function of environment, pressures, society, culture. We've got where we are, not by magic, and not because we've got a sky hook up to God telling us what to do. We've got where we are because of history. And I think any evidence or data from history is very welcome. I'm a naturalist in the sense I think it's nature that's made us how we are. And yes, our attitudes and sentiments and moral feelings are part of our natures.
Mm-hmm. But would the moral sentiments that we evolved have been enough, for example, for us to create moral systems as complex as we have today, including, for example, human rights?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, I'm not sure our moral systems are all that complicated, because as soon as people try to get beyond very simple utilitarianism or very, very, very simple sort of lists of prohibitions like the Ten Commandments, it proves very difficult to systematize an ethics in a way that even a significant number of people are going to agree with. So I think I'm a bit careful about the idea of moral system, but there's no doubt we have lots of attitudes, and some of those attitudes get expressions in notions like human rights. And this is the idea that there's some things which people owe to each other and that they must offer to each other. It's other people's due that they're behaved to in a certain way, they're treated a certain way. So if I say it's a human right not to be tortured, it's the flip side of saying everybody ought not to torture anybody else, which I believe actually. You know, I can campaign for that. I can give money to Amnesty International. I can avoid going to countries which behave badly in this respect, and so on. So sure, it's a notion that I can deploy. I use that notion. And obviously I stand by it, and it's an important part of my self-image, my persona. Would evolution be enough, or evolution and society and culture be enough to give me that notion? Well, it has been enough. I mean, it's not an accident that I have it and many other people have it. And of course, even people who don't, who aren't very strong, let us say, on the rights of others, are often very hot about their own rights. It's a natural asymmetry, just as we're selfish, that we get very hot under the collar very quickly when our own rights have been infringed, even if we're a bit lukewarm about infringing the rights of others. And that's part of what ethics is there to try to cure. we're not naturally a tremendously nice animal. And one of the things ethics tries to impose is a sense of, well, a sort of Kantian sense of it not being appropriate. I can't do anything. I can't admire anything unless I can admire it equally for all people. There's a kind of universality built into our moral notions. So if I claim a right for myself that you don't tread on my toe, then I ought to recognize that you've got a right against me that I don't tread on your toe. That's just a kind of piece of the logic of ethics, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and now perhaps a question about reason, because when people talk about the importance of philosophy in developing ethical systems,
Yes.
they tend to focus a lot on the role of reason in philosophy. And I mean, recently I've read Dan Sperber's and Hugo Mercier's book, The Enigma of Reason, and they collect a large amount of scientific data to show that reason is not absolutely reliable in terms of trying to think impartially, that reason operates much more with the end of producing rationalizations to our behavior after the fact, and that in trying to reach impartial conclusions about truth and reality and so on, it operates much better in groups of people with different ideas and different temperaments and so on. But this is the scientific perspective on it. But from a philosophical perspective, what would be the limitations that reason has?
Right. Well, in a sense, I think reason suffers from the same kind of debates that ethics does, because reason, as I see it, is a normative term. I think we shouldn't think of reason as a sort of little rational person inside the head, which is distinct from emotion and attitude and all the other cultural arrivals in our minds. I think we talk of reason when we talk of one consideration being a reason for another. So I talk of the fact that it's going to rain today is a reason for cancelling the picnic. The fact that it's going to rain may be a reason for carrying an umbrella, especially in England. On the other hand, the fact that we're running out of sprouts may be a reason to go to the shops. I mean, what I do is identify a consideration as bearing favorably on a plan or an intention or a desire or a belief. So I see reason as something, we talk about reason when we're advancing considerations for or against particular intentions, plans, propositions and beliefs. Now, of course, the trouble is that reason then is as contested as other parts of ethics. And in a sense, you can see reason as a word in which we do ethics for the mind, ethics for things like beliefs, attitudes, judgments, and so on. If you say that the fact that you're treading on my toe is no reason for you to move, obviously I think that's a really bad judgment of yours, but it's not a judgment I might find it easy to shift. I mean, I can't just say reason tells me that it is. You say, no, I don't see that any reasons. I might like to shift my foot off yours, but if I don't like to, I don't see that reason has anything to do with it. So reason is as contestable as other moral and ethical and normative judgments. Basically, reason is in the space of norms. We like to insist on norms of reason. So, for example, I think that if somebody believes in the young Earth creationists, say in America, they believe that the Earth is about 6,000 years old, because that accords with sort of biblical chronology. I think they're completely mad, completely unreasonable. There's a huge amount of authoritative science that tells us that it's about 4.5 billion years old, 4,500 million years old. So they take something as a reason, as a strong reason for believing one thing, and I think it's no reason at all. I could call them unreasonable, but to prove that they're unreasonable, I have to go into the detail, the number of uniformities of nature, a number of scientific laws or apparent laws, which all converge on telling us that the age of the Earth is many thousands of millions years old, 4,500 million. Evidence from isotopes, evidence from radioactivity, evidence from stratigraphic analysis, evidence from evolutionary history, all those point in the same direction. And against that they have one book, or two books, the Judaic record of kings and things. And I say, well, that just doesn't stand against it. It's totally unreasonable to take that as definitive in a way that the science is definitive. But they're going to say, no, it's not. the Bible or the Torah is the word of God, and God tells us that it's 6,000 years old. That's the end of it. And of course, I think that's unreasonable. So we go on, but the argument goes on about reason just as badly as it goes on about whether it's okay to treat prisoners a certain way, or whether it's okay to eat in restaurants while other people are starving across the world. So ethics and judgments of reason, I think, are unhappily quite alike. Now, you're right that there's been a movement in philosophy, quite recent, I think, which tries to say that that virtually every normative issue is better discussed in terms of reasons. And I'm not sure that's true. I don't think it's an advantage. You could do it, but I'm not sure it's getting you any further. Because reason doesn't stand like the voice of God telling everybody the same thing. Well, the voice of God never does that, but people like to think of it as doing so. Mm-hmm. God tells different people lots of different things.
Yeah, right. Okay, so there are people, and I don't know if I'm going to be a bit unfair here or not, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but there are people that it seems to me look at reason as if it was teleological. So for example, Peter Singer in the book The Expanding Circle kind of says that when reason in the evolutionary scene gets put into place cognitively in our minds, when it evolves, that because we have this sense that when other people behave towards us in a certain manner that we don't like it, and then also because we have kin selection and reciprocal altruism, we then expand it to our families and friends, and when reason gets into the picture, that it would be kind of inevitable that we would expand these rights, these ways we think that we shouldn't treat ourselves, our family and our friends, to eventually the entire humanity. So what would you say about that?
Well, Peter is following, he is a utilitarian in the sense that his ultimate ethical standard is welfare, the welfare of sentient creatures. But in that respect, in respect of the universalization properties of reason, he's following the Kantian tradition. I think the first person to hope to get substantive moral claims simply out of a conception of reason was probably Immanuel Kant. Aristotle thinks it's reasonable to be good, but I don't think Aristotle thought that reason had a kind of authority that determined ethics. Whereas I think Kant did think that, and I think Peter Singer thinks that. I don't think it's right. I mean, it seems to me, first of all, it's not at all, I think, consistent with an evolutionary picture, because an evolutionary picture, typically, if you talk about human life as we best understand it to have been in the millennia before history began, was almost certainly tribal. And if there's one thing that a tribal ethic gives you, it's not an expanding circle, it's a tight circle. You might have reciprocal relations with your kin and with other members of the tribe, with your society. But when you come across other societies, by and large, you kill them. I mean, this is how chimpanzees behave, and it's very likely how people behaved in the early days of humanity. I mean, all the evidence from not just fossils, but prehistoric bones and so on, suggests violence was the norm. It was the way people behaved, by and large. Many people are, found in prehistoric tombs and so on, who have been killed in quite nasty ways with blunt axes and stone tools and have their throats cut and God knows what. So I think we've got to be very careful about this rather automatic expansion of the circle. And still today, you look at someone like Donald Trump. He doesn't care a hoot about the rest of the world. He wants America first. He's a perfect example of a tribal leader, with a large tribe, admittedly, but still a tribal leader. And he doesn't care about separating Mexican kids from their parents, doing terrible things to prisoners, all kinds of stuff, if it can be seen to the benefit of his tribe. But if Peter comes along and tells Donald Trump that he's being irrational, Trump will say, no, I put America first. This is my priority. This is and so on. And of course, a lot of Republicans agree with him, unfortunately. So I think the world is not hospitable to any idea that the expanding circle is automatic. I think it's got to be really worked for. You've got to shift people's attitudes. But getting all people to feel like brothers and sisters is a matter of shifting attitudes. There's no syllogism which tells them that that's true.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so now another question would be, can we derive an ethical system just from science and scientific facts?
No. The old is-ought gap. It can be criticized, it's got to be very carefully framed and so on. But basically, there's always going to be a bridge between what the facts are like and how you care about them. That's obvious in what we just said about the expanding circle. Peter Singer can point out that welfare is increased across the world if America doesn't behave with trade tariffs and trade wars and so on. And that's very nice, and it will impress a lot of us, it would impress me, but there's no syllogism, no algorithm for making it impress Mr. Trump. He's going to persist in believing the other thing because his basic ideology is selfish and tribal and nationalistic, and that's true of his followers. Like any democratic politician, he's got to appeal to his followers. It's very sad.
yeah, that's right. Okay, so
I think Peter Singer was writing in a more optimistic age than us, actually.
Yeah, I guess the expanding circle was out perhaps 30 years ago or even
Yeah,
more, right?
yeah, exactly. Welfare states, the United Nations, all sorts of things were very hopeful signs. But now they've gone into reverse.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. But okay, so would you say that the reason why we can't derive a complete ethical system from science is because if we go along with science, we obtain an infinite or nearly infinite amount of facts about the world, and to create an ethical system, we have to choose
Yeah,
between those facts.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, and also the facts don't always point in a desirable direction. Let me give you an example. It's a paradox, a difficulty of economic savings theory. How much should we spend and how much should we save for the benefit of future generations? Well, now, if you suppose that the return is positive, that is, every dollar invested will give a positive return, so it will give the next generation slightly more than a dollar. And if you suppose that generations are going to go on forever, you rapidly get the result that you should never spend any money. You should save it all, because the net human welfare over generations is going to be increased if money doesn't disappear in consumption. If it's invested for the sake of the future, you're always going to get an expanding pot. So, if you suppose that welfare varies with wealth, you get the paradoxical result that it's never right to save anything.
Okay, so I guess we were talking about science, scientific facts, the possibility
Yeah.
of deriving ethical systems from science. Uh, and I guess that the next question I would pose is, so we can't derive an entire ethical system just out of scientific facts, because one of the main reasons is that we would have an infinite set of scientific facts,
Yeah.
and we would need to have beforehand moral axioms to
Yeah.
be able to choose among them. Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, the history of ethics shows us a lot of this. As I expect your listeners know, Jeremy Bentham, one of the first utilitarians, thought that it was all straightforward. You could just observe. In a sense, you observed happiness and you maximized it, and that was the end of it. And of course, almost immediately, first of all, John Stuart Mill realized that happiness is not a common currency. It doesn't work like a number of dollar bills that you have, because it's a very variable thing. There's so-called higher pleasures, lower pleasures. They're pleasures which you wouldn't give up for anything. They're pleasures which you don't care very much about. And of course, then the distributions of happiness. There's some people you might think who don't deserve to be happy because, for example, their happiness lies in domination of others. They're not happy unless they're cock of the walk. Does their happiness matter? They're not happy unless they're sadists and inflicting pain on other people. Does that happiness matter? So on. So the happiness of the Roman crowds looking at gladiatorial fights, that's not a very edifying thing to maximize. So you really have to be very careful about thinking that it's simple, because the entire history of ethics shows that it's not. And so the science is not going to charge it with an objective and empirical answer to these questions.
Mm-hmm. And do these moral axioms that we have to have beforehand in trying to set an ethical system have to be always self-evidently true and universalizable, or not?
No, I don't think so. I think that, I mean, again, going back to Bentham and Mill, their hope was for a kind of axiomatic system. You'd have an overarching principle, the principle of utility, you somehow frame it so it looked plausible, and you could derive moral results from that. More and more moral thinkers, not just myself, but others, have gone back to what's in effect a much more Aristotelian picture, in which we have quite a lot of values. Some of them cohere together, some of them conflict. So there may be a trade-off. In our own lives, we know that there's a trade-off between how much effort you expend on your friends, how much effort you expend on your family, how much effort you expend on yourself. And these things may look different at different times. And the idea of a system just waiting to be axiomatized and then in some sort of computing way churning out answers to practical problems has appealed to very few people in recent moral philosophy. Going back to Aristotle, you find you start in the middle of things, in medias res. That is, you start making judgments, and then you realize that it's difficult to make your judgments all coherent. So you start to tinker, and gradually you hope to build up a kind of organic set of, maybe even principles is the wrong word. Principles is very contested in moral philosophy, but an organic set of judgments with at least a pattern to them. Some things you regard as important, other things you don't regard as so important. Some things take priority over others, and so on. So you get a nest or an amalgam of what are sometimes called prima facie results or prima facie duties. And your best hope is that your overall system is defensible. But it won't be defensible because it's derived from few simple self-evident axioms. That's I think, a will o' the wisp, a pie in the sky.
Yes, but when we talk about the ontological ethics, and perhaps a good example of it would be human rights, because I mean, if we are to have human rights, they have to be based on certain moral values, which we cannot really question.
Yes, I mean, it may be that for example, a tribunal, a court of law, that has to work with codified laws, and those are going to have a kind of absolute flavor. They'll have an absolute core. But even courts of law find that it's not easy to draw up the rules. If you, I mean, this is maybe a slightly absurd example, but I think it makes the point. You'd think it might be quite easy for a government. A government is there for the welfare of the people. Let's say that's what it has to do. To promote that welfare, it needs various things like police, it needs a judiciary, it needs defense, it needs to attend the welfare of the people by medical services and so on. For all that, it needs taxation. It needs resources to enable it to perform those tasks. So you might think that it would be quite simple to develop a tax code. It's not. The English, the British tax code, I believe, now runs to 17,000 pages.
Mm.
Yes. No one person can master it. You have to have specialist accountants who deal with corporation tax, accountants who deal with inheritance tax, accountants who deal with this, that, and the other. So it proves incredibly difficult, and every time a government thinks, well, this would be a fair taxation system, tax, I don't know, the rich more than the poor, for example, that sounds like a good principle. But then you come to the idea that, well, we want to incentivize people. We don't want the rich just to stop working because we're taking all their money in tax. And of course, if you're in a competitive economy, you don't want companies to go abroad because they're overtaxed. So you want them to pay just the right amount of tax, and then you get different industries making different claims, and so on. So complexity builds and builds and builds. And eventually finding any rhyme or reason in those 17,000 pages is going to be most impossible. And that's I think that's a model for human life, I'm afraid. It is a bit like that.
Yeah. And I mean, perhaps a question that I would pose now is, has there any been really an ethical system with rules, let's put it that way, that had really no exceptions whatsoever? So, for example, when referring to these, people usually give the example of religion as having a set of moral truths that are set in place supposedly by God, and that they have no exceptions whatsoever. But even religious people usually don't really universalize their set of moral truths to encompass the entirety of humanity, right?
No, and even the rules that we have got admit of elasticity, exceptions. I mean, the commandment, thou shalt not kill.
Yeah.
Okay, what about Christian wars? What about Islam? What about, I mean, God may tell you not to kill, but he doesn't tell you exactly what the limits of the are. Now, of course, it's possible to be an absolute pacifist, say, no, we must never kill. But then you might get cases, where mercy killing is suggested. The usual case is the truck driver who is caught in a burning cab, and you can't get him out, but you could shoot him. Otherwise, he's going to slowly burn to death. Well, it would seem the right thing to do would be to shoot him. And if your religion says, no, you can't do that, then I think so much the worse for your religion. It's giving you a false certainty, a certainty which the case does not admit of. And similar for many cases. Obviously, some religionists take thou shalt not kill to apply to very early term babies, fetuses. Others say, no, it only applies to persons, and these things are not yet persons. They're more like eggs or acorns than they're like chickens or oak trees. So it always leads to hard cases.
Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about religion in ethical terms and from a philosophical perspective, would you say that what we call religious is not really referring to a moral system that is absolutist, but rather that it is justified on the basis of some sort of divine character, for example, a god? Well,
I think I believe that a religion is basically a second-hand philosophy. It's a set of ideas about how to live, which is drummed up and impressed in people's minds by the devices of religious conversion, religious authority, religious instruction. So typically a religion would hope to get hold of people at a very young age. It impresses on them the character of sacred things in that society. And they go away convinced that there's an authority which has told them that killing is wrong, or that adultery is wrong, or that coveting your neighbour's ass is wrong. And they believe that without any further thought. And that's, no doubt, from a sort of evolutionary point of view, maybe quite functional. Maybe good that enough people in a society have rather a simple, fairly well understood set of rules, and they try to live by that. And there's evidence, actually, I think, that communities and societies that have that kind of ethos do better than ones which are secular and educated and in which everybody tries to think for themselves. But I prefer the second sort of society. I don't like the idea of just marching in step like an army of thoughtless sort of zombies. That's not enlightenment, as Kant said. That's turning people into ciphers. And it's very dangerous because, of course, the next thing that happens is it may be a theological leader or it may be a secular leader comes along, often harnesses the authority of the church, and then all hell breaks loose. I mean, that's the way fascism worked. That's the way dictatorships worked in Spain and Portugal. The church collaborated with some pretty nasty regimes. And of course, once you think that right is on your side, you think you're permitted to do anything to crush dissent and to crush opposition. So I think that the authoritarian tendencies of human beings are very badly served. They're aided by the authority of theocracies and priests. And I think that's a very bad thing. Very, very dangerous thing.